Code word in 25 minutes from now, and 5:25 you'll hear the final code word of the day. 225, 425, 525. They're your code word times for Sports Bash Cash. Today you're winning Pete's money. Tomorrow will be my money. Josh will pay you on Wednesday's show. That's how it worked. The Sports Bash Cash continues here on 97.3 ESPN. John McMullen joins us here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. We talk NFL. He writes at 973ESPN.com. He asked this question, Pete Thompson. Did Howie Roseman overplay his hand with Nick Foles, which, of course, has a lot of angry people in Twitter and Facebook land? John, welcome.
What a surprise.
How dare you imply that the Eagles should have traded Nick Foles when his value was at its highest?
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. It's a crazy thought. I understand. I always talk about I understand the emotion of it and what Nick Foles did for this organization and did for this city. But bottom line, he's a backup quarterback, and you're a team without a second and a third-round pick coming up later this month. It's about moving forward now. Carson Wentz is the quarterback of this team. That is clear. That it should be clear to everyone. And we start to get sort of muddled in luxuries. And what I tried to point out is it's very, very unlikely, and that's probably being kind, that a similar situation develops like this year into next year. So I'm not sure what the need for Nick Foles is if you can get, say, a second and a third-round pick. And by the way, I don't even know if the Eagles can get that now because the dominoes have fallen on the quarterback market. So, Mike, I've been, and a lot of these people criticizing me were not very happy when Howie Roseman got this job back, and I defended him. I think by and large he's made a lot of smart decisions. And that has borne out. I don't think this is one of them.
Yeah, and I wasn't the biggest Howie guy, but I also didn't think he was a complete idiot. A lot of people just thought he was unqualified, didn't deserve the job, and I thought maybe, he was the Sam Bradford of front office executives, where it's very hard to quantify how good or bad Bradford is because he's had so many different offensive coordinators, he's changed so many different teams, yada yada yada. So everybody just assumes he stinks. And there's a lot of variables. Same with Howie. That was he making picks? Was Reed making picks? Was Kelly making picks? Was he really that much in charge in his first incarnation of general manager? But by and large, he's done a really good job here in the second incarnation of general manager. But that doesn't mean he's going to get 100% of the things right. And maybe this is one that you say maybe he overplayed. Maybe sentimentally they decided, let's not move on from Nick Foles because there might be a similar situation next year that might never come up, and you can't recoup missing out on a second and third round pick.
Yeah, and I think if you look at it, I think one of the issues is there's a disconnect. And I understand why. There's a disconnect with this fan base that believes Nick Foles has more value around this league than he really does. Now, Howie is not caught up in that. He understands it. But he was also trying to go into a situation where Nick's value has never been higher and try to push it and try to get that one team to overpay. So I don't put him in that grouping of looking at a guy and just overvalue him. I think he just overplayed his hand. And we'll see. I could be wrong. Ultimately, he might get more than a second-round pick. That's already been offered. If you look at what happened with Jimmy Garoppolo, who's got a much higher ceiling, according to NFL decision makers, much younger, obviously has a longer shelf life. All he got was a second-round pick. Now, all second-round picks aren't created equal. That was a very valuable one because the 49ers were a very bad team. But nonetheless, look, and this blows Eagles fans' minds, but it's the reality. Sam Bradford of 2016 had more value in this league than Nick Foles.
John,
you can say that's wrong, but that's the way decision makers in this league think.
and when you talk about Nick Foles' value, John, we know that he almost walked away from the game. Do you think there could be a stigma about him out there that the only reason he's still playing football is because it's the Eagles? He's comfortable there. He might not be happy going somewhere else.
No, I don't necessarily think it's a stigma. That's how poorly things went for Nick in with the Rams, and he contemplated walking away from the game. Luckily for the Eagles, he didn't. I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is people look at him. And remember, if you go back to last year at this time, people in this league didn't look at Nick Foles as a starter. Now they do, but he's a bottom third starter, from 20 to 30, think, if you're going to rate the starting quarterbacks in this league. People get caught, and they'll say Super Bowl MVP, Super Bowl MVP. And I always tell them, scouts in this league don't run highlights on a loop. In fact, when they look at quarterbacks, and I've had more than one scout explain this to me, what you want to do is look at their bad plays. You want to look at their mistakes and learn from that. And what I mean by that is you sort of look at if they throw an interception. Why did they throw the interception? Was it bad decision making? Was it poor mechanics? What went wrong on the play? And then did they learn from it? Did they keep committing the same mistake over and over? You don't just look at highlights. If you're in the NFL playing the quarterback position, if everything's going well, you're going to make some great plays. That's everybody. What you want to do is learn from the bad times. And just because Nick Foles won the Super Bowl doesn't mean every scout in this league stopped looking at the Dallas game, the Oakland game, what he did with the Rams. They all have that in the bank as well.
You talk about Howie Roseman, and you write about Howie Roseman having the valuable card in Nick Foles still left. When does that card become worthless, and how much do you think that weighs on Howie of the value decreasing and when he can afford to play it?
Well, I think the value's already decreased. I don't know if anyone will give up a second-round pick at this point because the dominoes have already fallen. Most teams have declared what they're going to do with the quarterback position. They've either signed players or they're jockeying in the draft to get players. Unfortunately for the Eagles, this was a rare year where there were a lot of options, both on the free agent market and in the draft. So that hurt. Now you're into the situation where you're sort of hoping for the injury in August, but that's also what I pointed out. It's not only an injury, it has to be an injury on the right team. In other words, if your quarterback gets hurt late in the process, like happened with Minnesota back in 2016, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be desperate enough to make that trade. You have to be in a certain position. The Vikings at the time thought they were a Super Bowl contender. They didn't want to throw away the year. Now, if a 4-12 team or a team that's going to win 5 games or even 8 or 9, even push for a playoff spot, suffers an injury, they're not going to be willing to just give up a first-round pick. They would rather sort of take the hit for the 1 year, get the better draft capital, the better draft pick. So, as I explained, it's almost like, forget about lightning striking twice in the same spot. It's more like lightning striking 3 times in the same spot. It's not going to happen. So, and then you get into next year, and obviously the leverage is gone. So I think if the Eagles don't pull the trigger, and again, they might not have the opportunity to pull the trigger any longer. The bottom line is Nick Foles is going to go somewhere else to be a starter after next season, and they're not going to be able to get anything back in return for him.
So are there teams out there still, even though some of the dominoes have already fallen, are there teams out there that you think the Eagles match up better with if they were to pursue this? I mean, do you see gaping?
Who's left?
I mean,
that's really what it comes down to. Who's left?
Yeah,
that would be interesting.
Not many. I mean, you see Buffalo. Buffalo, in theory, could still want somebody to compete with A.J. McCarron, but they're trying to go up in the draft. Are the Miami Dolphins serious about Brock Osweiler as a backup to Ryan Tannehill? Well, I don't know. But do they really want to bring in Nick Foles to be a backup? Probably not. The Jets are going to draft a quarterback. That's where the overplaying of the hand comes in. The dominoes have already fallen.
Do you think that Howie, I mean, obviously he's going to try, but do you think that's a priority on draft day or now leading into the draft to try to recoup a second or a third and or both?
Yeah.
And do they have current, other than Foles, do they have any other thing they can get creative with to try to recoup that, or is Foles the main piece of ammunition to try to do that?
Well, Foles was the main piece. I think now the better piece to get in probably a third-round pick might be a Ronald Darby, because obviously teams always need cornerback help. It's not that the Eagles don't like him, but they realize he's going to be in line for a big raise next year, and they still have salary cap issues moving forward. So he's probably easier to move, and you could probably get a third-round pick for a guy with that kind of talent. Earlier in the process, I mean, the Eagles got offered a second-round pick for Nick Foles and said no. So they definitely want to add. They don't want to pick 32nd and then not be up again until the fourth round. They definitely want to get back into the draft earlier. Now, they can do that in a number of ways. They could move back from 32, pick up an extra piece that way. As I said, they could trade Darby. They can trade Kendricks in a pick, maybe to move up. They can do a number of things, but Nick Foles was the easiest, but it was the easiest before the dominoes started to fall. Now it's not the easiest.
Hey, John, on Friday's show, Brian Baldinger joined us, and he mentioned Orlando Brown at 32. He might be a name that a lot of listeners aren't that familiar with, and quite frankly, anybody at 32 might be a name that a lot of listeners aren't that familiar with. But he did mention that the Brown family was somebody that Joe Douglas and Andy Weidel had been familiar with, and you wonder how much that does play a role come draft day, familiarity with a guy and a family and saying, you know, this kid's been running around since he's a 12-year-old. We know a lot about him because he did not have a very good combine. So when somebody brings his name up as a first-round pick, you might say, well, he had a horrible combine. But maybe that gets thrown out the window in a situation like this.
Yeah, and I thought it was an interesting thing to say by Baldy, and I think it's correct because football is so sort of caught up in relationships and people you know, and that's really how a lot of things get done. And his dad, Orlando Brown's dad, Orlando Brown Sr., was a long-time right tackle for the Ravens, very good right tackle. The reality
was
is...
he the guy that had the... No, he wasn't the guy that had the referee throw the flag and hit him in the eye?
Yeah, he was.
Was that him?
Yeah, for Cleveland, right?
I pulled that one right out of right.
You know,
My eyes shot up.
His nickname was Zeus, and you know when you look at combine numbers for offensive linemen, look, 40 times or throw them out, it's meaningless. But there are issues with the strength he showed, and on the other side of the equation, you have the fact that the reality is that he's very good on film, and he was a very good college player. So you kind of try to figure out what is it. Was it a bad day? He was a little bit better at his pro day, but still not great. I think the Eagles could have a lot of interest because of that history, but to me, I don't know if you need to pick him at 32 because he hurt himself so much. Now, he's not going to be around in the fourth round, though. And that's what we kind of talked about, is the reality the Eagles don't want to go into this process, be picking at 32, and then not picking again until the third day in the fourth round. They want to get back into it before then. So maybe they trade down from 32 and get him in the second round, something of that nature. I can't picture him taking him at the 32nd pick. But if they like him, I mean, that's a position that makes sense because obviously Jason Peters is not going to be around forever. I'm not sure if they're completely sold on Vaitai being the heir apparent long term. So I do think they want to bring in a potential body there to groom, but I just can't see it at number 32.
Hey, when we look at football over the years, back in the day, the Eagles famously, had Bobby Taylor drafted so that they could try to stop Michael Irvin. A lot of times teams in the division, they'll draft guys to combat the team that just won. What are other teams going to try to do in the division to combat what the Eagles have done?
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily, and I think this speaks to what Doug was able to do. And we were speaking off air, but I think it's ironic how many fans, at the beginning, he mentioned about Doug throwing out the first pitch and how people jumped on Gabe Kapler so early, and probably rightfully so, but it's tremendously early. Nobody liked Doug Peterson early. They all thought he was an idiot. And all of a sudden he brings home the Super Bowl championship, and now he's the greatest coach ever. And I think the reality is he has done such a wonderful job. And I think the change is, I don't think it's personnel related. I think you have to adjust to what the Eagles did, both scheme wise with the RPOs and aggressiveness wise with the fourth downs and pushing things and putting so much pressure. I think the tweaks go there. I don't know. If you look at this team, the strength is clearly the defensive line. So you're always going to have issues trying to block that front. There's no question. But I don't see it as the Giants and the Redskins and the Cowboys trying to bolster their offensive lines to deal with that defensive line. I think they have to adjust to what Doug has done from his coaching style.
John, you mentioned Michael Kendricks a minute ago and said that if the Eagles, that may be an option for trading him. Of course, it makes sense from the $4.4 million in savings they get. But what about Michael Kendricks makes him attractive to the other teams? What skill set does he have that makes him an attractive trade piece?
Well, I don't know how attractive he is because of his salary. He did prove he could be an effective three-down linebacker, though, once Jordan Hicks went down. The problem is, his salary makes him have to be that. In other words, it's not cost effective for him to be anything other than a three-down linebacker. It's somebody who's going to be playing, and he could be for a number of teams in this league, a whole host of them. But when you start talking about what are you going to get back in return, because the salary is as high as it is, it's not going to be as much as it could be, say, if it was a very young player who was still on a cost-effective rookie contract who could also save you money and play at a high level. I think that's the bigger issue with Michael Kendricks, and the value you get in return. The contract hurts you in that type of scenario.
Talk with John McMullen here on the Boardwalk Honda hotline at JF McMullen. Give him a follow on Twitter. A lot of this story over the last day or so is kind of interesting. Jim Mora, the coach at UCLA, basically, in so many words, came out and I don't want to say ripped, but he ripped his quarterback, Josh Rosen, and basically says he needs to be challenged. Essentially, he's sending a message that if this guy's not interested, he doesn't really. I mean, once he masters something, that's it. He wants to move on to something else. Now, some people would say, why would he go out and do this? But isn't it refreshing that maybe the guy is saying, I don't want to look like an idiot by telling you something that this guy's not, so I'm going to tell you the truth? Or is Mora doing a disservice to his player?
Well, I think there's a little of both, but I think he was just telling the truth. And
right, but
talking about his personnel.
It's like people are ripping him for potentially telling the truth, whereas so many times in the past, you ask the college coach and he says, what a great kid, he throws all the throws, and then you look like a fool because this guy couldn't make all the throws. Why would we take your opinion? And now he's saying, You know what I mean? Like, it's a weird dynamic with this. When I read that, I was like, you know what? It is kind of refreshing that the guy came out and said, well, this is what he needs to do better.
Yeah, nobody knows him better. He coached him. And obviously, a couple years ago, he also said that if Rosen was draft eligible, and this was during the Jared Goff, Carson Wentz draft, that he would have been picked in front of both of those. So it's not like he's constantly killing the kid, and that's why I do think he was just telling the truth. And he's a guy who asks why and doesn't just do things. And I think in a lot of ways you have this old school football environment that's sort of like the military, and they want you to just go out and do what you're told and not ask questions. And he threw out the millennial word, which is an insult, even though, look, every quarterback who's going to get taken in this draft is a millennial by definition. But people use that term to describe a certain group inside millennials that are, you know, for lack of a better word, more inquisitive than others. And sometimes that can be a problem, especially with some coaches. But look, I say it all the time. If you're a slave to your scheme, you're not going to succeed in this league. Your job as a coach is to maximize the strengths of your players and try to hide as many deficiencies as possible. And you can always, you know, you should have a scheme. You should have a belief in what you want to do, what works best. And you're always working to get towards the perfect roster and all the players that can run that particular scheme. But good coaches know you never get to that point. That's not reality. You're never going to have a perfect 53. So you got to make do with what you have. And the best coaches, as I said, maximize the strengths of their players. And I talk about it all the time. You know, Chip Kelly thought his system was the star. Doug Peterson, as a guy who played 14 years in this league, understands it's about talent. And you see the dichotomy in the last two coaches of the Philadelphia Eagles. One thought the system was the star. The other one understands the players are what wins in this league. And it depends where Josh Rosen ends up, just as any coach and any quarterback in any system. It's more than just talent. He clearly has talent, but he's got to find an organization and a staff that can grow that talent and maximize it.
John McMullen at JF McMullen on Twitter, appearing via the Boardwalk Honda hotline here on the Sports Bash Live on 97.3 ESPN. John, enjoyed it as always, pal.
Hey, thank you, guys.
All right, John.